Okay, everybody, if you can please take your seats. We're going to get started with the last portion of the agenda. You guys are all ready? Okay. So before we jump into our executive roundtable, I wanted to poll the audience. So if you can get your devices out again, we are going to do another audience poll. So to set things up for this discussion, the question that we had for you is to do a bit of a word cloud. And we want to know what one word comes to you when you think of the future challenges that we should be preparing for today. So one word, and we're going to see an image start to form as we hear what's on people's minds. Oh, good music. So as we wait for the results to populate, I just have one administrative item I wanted to mention, that we will have an online survey that's going to be going out to you after the summit, and we'd really appreciate if you take a few minutes to fill that out. It won't take long, and it really helps us to prepare for future summits. So how are we doing? All right, we still have many of you to put your vote in. Climate change, storage, politics. All right. Give it a minute or two and see what else we get in there. Okay, Jessica, I'm gonna leave you with this and see how the panel reacts to this. But there's some really interesting things coming up on here. Kawhi. Raptors on the mind all day, you guys. That's great. So I think, you know what, this is a really interesting diagram, because what you're seeing is what's on people's minds here. And with, 71 responses coming in, climate change, politics, storage, all great segues to this panel. I think you'll all be well prepared to talk about those items. So with that, I'm going to introduce our executive roundtable, which will be moderated by Jessica Savage, Director of Corporate and Regulatory Affairs at the IESO. Joining the roundtable are Paul Grod of Rodan Energy Solutions, Leonard Kula of the IESO, Derek Lim-Su of Peak Power, and Annette Verschuren of Enerstore Inc. Our moderator, Jessica Savage, is responsible for managing the IESO's relationship with municipalities, customers, media, sector stakeholders, and the public to ensure productive partnerships. In her 15 years with the IESO, Jessica has held senior roles across the organization, including market development, government, and regulatory affairs and operations. Jessica will lead these esteemed panelists in a discussion on how the sector can work together to use changes to the benefit of the market and to create opportunities for all resources and explore the speed at which these changes need to happen. Please welcome Jessica, who will introduce each of the panelists. Jessica?
Thank you, Carrie. So unlike Frank, the moderator for the previous panel, I do not have a real-time update on Kauai's coordinates, but considering that this is the last panel of the day, I think it's fair to say we started from the bottom, now we're here. We started from the bottom, now we're here. And hopefully that is the last Raptor/Drake reference you will have to endure for the rest of the afternoon. But in all seriousness, thank you to everyone who's still here and stayed despite the historic celebrations happening outside. We've got 4 dynamic panelists today who need no introduction, so I will let you read their biographies at your leisure. We've got Paul Grod, Derek Lim-Su, Annette Verschuren, and Leonard Kula. So the format for today's session, I'm going to give each speaker approximately 5 minutes to make some opening remarks. Then I'm going to kick it off with an opening question. And in the meantime, we're going to display a couple of topics on Slido for the audience to rate in terms of priority and the type of thing they'd like to hear this panel talk about. As well, comments from the floor are very welcome. This is not a shy panel, and during our preparation calls, we had some politely punchy conversations. So I'm hoping we can recreate some of that dialogue here today. So without further ado, here is my first question. Based on the evolving electricity sector, and specifically the integration of new resources, that were not contemplated during market design activities for market opening almost 2 decades ago, how do you view the future of the electricity space? And what specific opportunities should we be enabling and preparing for today? So I'm going to kick it off with you, Paul.
Thanks, Jessica. First off, thanks for the invitation, the opportunity to be here. One of the sort of early comments I wanted to make was I was thinking about this panel. When I first founded Rodan 16 years ago, I remember coming to events similar to this, and you would look at the panelists, and they were typically the CEO of one of the major LDCs, CEO of the ISO, CEO of OPG, CEO of Hydro One. And today we're seeing the wrap-up panel is CEOs of new companies that are the services companies who are enabling new grids and new technologies. So it really demonstrates, I think, how we're evolving as a sector. And I want to recognize and thank the ISO for recognizing that and for allowing us to participate and present. In terms of what we didn't contemplate, and I recall being part of some of the early stakeholdering around the smart grid, what the AMI looks like, and a lot of those graphics about what the advanced metering infrastructure, smart metering entity, and everything else is going to look like, it hasn't, I mean, it's evolved, but I think we had a view of where we want it to be. But it's taken us a while to get to where we are today. We're really enabling demand-side resources, unlike we never were able to before. And I think we've put some of the infrastructure in, like the AMI network, but we also recognize that it's not really where we expected it to be just yet. And in particular, things like access to data, getting faster and more effective access to data is something we're still struggling with. We are also needing to talk about what are some of the key drivers to our new grid. One of the things I think that we should be thinking about in terms of what we may have not thought of 2 decades ago, but what's important for us today is how do we handle stranded asset costs on the system? Because that's something that we've been talking about. I know it's one of the things that a number of the LDCs are concerned about. And these are things we have to contemplate and address and figure out what that is so we can bake it into the cost of new distributed energy resources we've been talking about today. So it's a combination of not just new technologies, but how do we address the existing grid? Because the reality is, even though distributed energy is the new reality, we still have that necessity to be connected to the power grid, and that's not going away. So we have to figure out how we're going to cover those costs.
Okay. So maybe I'll start with a little bit about Peak Power, just so people have some background on us. So Peak Power is an Ontario-based software company that has created predictive analytics on how to optimize the operations of batteries in buildings, electric vehicles, and also the buildings themselves as a grid resource. We're also working on a transactive energy pilot right now to create a more efficient way of being able to buy and sell services from distributed energy resources. With regards to your question there, I would say just 3 points. One, I mean, I see a future heavily biased by my thought around DER proliferation. And I think that we have a very unique optimization opportunity to figure out how we can incorporate those DERs appropriately within the grid. The end result is if we don't do that, we're going to have a situation of hundreds of megawatts of assets that will be operated by different people for different reasons, and it'll be almost impossible to be able to plan at the LDC level or at the ISO level. Two, I would say things to recognize is we're living in a period of rapid innovation that we've never seen before, right? The emergence of AI, the proliferation of EVs taking over internal combustion engines, and just DRs in general that provide a solution today, but the cost is dropping. So we need to figure out a way to, there's a huge sense of urgency to solve this sooner rather than later, right? Because we don't have as much time as everybody thinks. The third point that I bring up is there's a huge opportunity for software. So if the future holds that it's going to be a lot of DERs in balance with some of the larger macro assets, to aggregate many devices to provide the reliability and the performance that larger assets have done, the importance of software is going to be really, really important, right? To not only ensure that you don't have underutilization of these smaller assets and allow you to stack revenue streams, but also to ensure that you've got visibility to the utilities and to the ISOs to ensure that they're confident things are going to actually be fulfilled, right? And there's a lot of different ways that we can talk about to go do that. So those are the three things I'd say is just, there's been a lot of talk about a lot of different things today, but I do think, DERs are proliferating and it's going to be a great optimization opportunity. 2, we don't have as much time as you think. And 3, the word software, like I've been in energy for 20 years now, the word software and electricity don't go hand in hand, right? I mean, if you think about software in the last 20 years, it's all been around SCADA, right? It's all been around control software, right? But all the new innovation today is around data science. It's the power of data science that's going to unlock more accurate forecasting to not only figure out how to utilize better the existing resources, but also how to integrate the new resources that come into play. So those are the 3 points I'd like to bring up just to start the conversation.
Great, thanks. Annette?
My name is Erica Stern. I'm from Energy Storage, Energy Storage.
Mike.
Energy Storage is an energy storage development company. We are right across the supply side of the electricity market, from grid-connected facilities to behind the meter to remote communities. We just did our first Indigenous deal in British Columbia, and also residential. And so I got into this business 12 years ago, mainly because I knew that we could store food quite well, we could store water quite well, but we weren't very good at storing energy. And I am a very customer-driven person. I had the great thrill of opening up a couple of retail operations. The experience I had at Home Depot was quite phenomenal. Ursilia, that you met a little bit earlier today, she and I 20 years ago started programs across the country to work with utilities to introduce efficiency, work with them to bring homes to higher standards, insulation standards, lighting standards, etc. And it was unbelievable the response we got from Canadians across Canada in doing that. So I have this knowledge of where I believe the customer wants to go. And I think 20 years ago, this market was very different than it is today. What I have seen just in battery technology and how costs have gone down and how we're getting battery technology development right across the grid in very aggressive ways. I just see a business with great opportunity for change. And just a little aside, when I was running Home Depot, when I started, all the power equipment was electrically, corded. When I left, everything was a battery. And I remember the second or third year in these clunky batteries, we said, this is never going to work. And all the incumbents were saying, it's never going to work. And I just see that this change is coming. And I really want the industry to respond quicker, faster. I want the regulators to line up. I want the regulators, for instance, to allow new technology, new businesses to not have the same regulations as a 400 megawatt gas generation has. There's all kinds of things that really stop and slow down the introduction of technology. The whole discussion on demand and supply side, we really do need to be more creative in performance. We have this little flywheel facility that we have with the ISO, and we recently studied it with them, and it can produce frequency regulation two and a third times faster than a traditional generation facility. And what's really cool about storage is it is a load and it is a generator. It gives the grid and everything around it flexibility. We've only been one way. We've been going towards generation all these years in the main. And yes, there are pumped hydro facilities. I know that we use hydro to back it up. We do all kinds of interesting things to redirect the surplus energy. But we have too much surplus energy in our system, and it's time we stop producing more and we start taking the surplus that we have and making it more efficient. And energy storage is not just the answer. it is demand side, all kinds of different energy efficiencies, et cetera. And Efficiency Nova Scotia was one of the first groups that I worked with. What an impressive organization they are. And it's because they have one customer. I think Terry said it. And I'll tell you, it made all the difference in the world to execute programs and move the needle faster. And that's what we have to do. I don't want to wake up in 5 years' time and think about what's going to happen in 5 years. It's going to be, I think, an extraordinarily different landscape. And I think we need to be ready for it. Look, we invented basketball in Canada. We did. And we also had the first NBA game with the Huskies here in Toronto in 1946. Canadians didn't like basketball, they went down south. But this is our game, and I think we should own innovation in our country. And we are great, smart people, and we're particularly smart in the electricity market. And I just want to see it go faster, further, and really create those other opportunities and jobs that I think that are out there that can really drive this change.
Leonard? Over to you, Leonard. Not Kawhi.
Well, I wasn't going to go there, but I will since you brought it up. One of the unexpected benefits of the Raptors run is that when I go into Starbucks now, 9 times out of 10, the barista can never spell my first name. And now with Kawhi Leonard being here and being very prominent, they get it right 9 times out of 10, so unexpected benefit. So I'm going to react to a couple of words. So as I listened to the presentations earlier today, as I looked at the screen here, as I listened to my esteemed fellow panelists, some words jumped out. Flexibility, services, reliability and resilience, risk, price signals for dispatch and investment, competitive markets drive innovation. They're more than just words spoken at this conference and on this panel. These are words that that dominate my thoughts all day, every day, because even as I think for the future, I have to be prepared for today. And so it's those thoughts in mind that I want to hit on a few points. First of all, as you know, we're responsible for the reliability of the bulk electric system. And as you know, we also operate a wholesale electricity market that we are evolving for energy capacity and many types of ancillary services like operating reserve and frequency regulation. These markets allow us to achieve reliability in an efficient manner. So I always want to make sure that people understand that when we talk about markets, they don't exist for the sake of having markets. They allow us to achieve a reliable outcome in the most efficient manner possible. As the electricity sector evolves, the challenges that the ISO facing as the system operator are increasing. The sector consists of multiple suppliers, and while there was in the vertically integrated utility days of Ontario Hydro, there were a limited number of participants. That increased shortly after we opened the market, and now the number of participants that we have are significantly greater than that. And as we talk about innovation and more participants and enabling more folks, we expect more participants. These suppliers come with different objectives, technologies, risk profiles, and business models that we all have to understand in order to bring this and integrate it effectively. At the ISO, we recognize the steady march of new technologies operating in the electricity system or on their way, with a wide range of operating characteristics. These represent both a tremendous opportunity, but they also bring with it challenges. And an example would be the increased penetration of inverter-based systems such as wind, solar, and batteries. New technologies, new operating characteristics. There's nothing faster from a system response perspective, or one of the fastest responses that we get is from our wind generating fleet. When we have to balance supply and demand, we send signals to them to change their output, and they respond very, very quickly. But all these inverter-based systems, wind, solar, and batteries and others, introduce new challenges because the inverters represent a different system impact from an inertia standpoint, and so we need to stay on top of these evolving characteristics as we go. We observe the continued transformation of the resource fleet across North America to newer sources of supply. often with less assurance that the fuel is going to be there to drive generation output. In Ontario, we have a very diverse resource mix. Nuclear, hydroelectric, gas, demand response, wind, solar, just to name a few. We have to recognize that we have this great diversity, and it gives us great amounts of reliability and resilience. Other jurisdictions have over time seen a concentration of their resources, which exposes them to things going wrong. And any resource has its limitations, but in aggregate, all the diverse resources in Ontario combine to bring a more effective solution. And so as we consider newer technologies as part of this panel, I'm very cognizant that that they bring that opportunity for increased diversity and increased reliability and resiliency as a result. Of course, we also see new patterns of consumption driven by embedded generation, conservation, and programs like the Industrial Conservation Initiative, which have a significant impact upon the way that we operate the power system in Ontario. So what's this mean as I look to the future? The theme of the day is that the system is changing, and to me it seems like it's changing at a faster rate every day. Maybe it's just because I'm in the middle of it that it seems like that. Playing the role that we play in the power system, we often see the challenges in operating the power system, and we look for ways to solve those problems. And so we're constantly in solution mode. But what I have noticed many times, and it's always at the forefront of my mind, is that the sector, generators, consumers, transmitters, distributors, developers of new technologies, have an almost unlimited ability to effectively innovate and put forth solutions that can help address evolving power system needs. And so I recognize that it's just not an IESO challenge alone. As market and system operator, our roles include monitoring the power system as it evolves and identifying if we're making sure that we've got the services we need to operate the power system reliably. And the report mentioned earlier by Peter in his opening address, the IESO report on the review of operability of the IESO controlled grid to 2025 is an example of that, studying system inertia, frequency response, and response to system contingencies with increased quantities of distributed energy resources is an example of how we look forward to monitor how the system is evolving. A key part of what we do is to assess and publish our expectations for the future so that you as sector participants can see the need for reliability services and put forth the services we need for the power system. And examples include our quarterly reliability outlook and the annual planning outlook, which you'll see in September. As an aside, it's important to remind you that as much as we forecast, our forecasts are never going to be perfect predictors of the future. But to quote one of my colleagues, Chuck Farmer, our goal is not to be perfect, but to be credible, to provide guidance to both you and us on what are reasonable actions to take. And last but not least, we want to establish competitive frameworks, such as through markets, to value and acquire the reliability services we need to unlock innovation and effective solutions.
Thank you, panelists, for your opening perspectives. Can I ask that the Slido questions be put up on the screen, please? So we've got 4 different categories of questioning here. Multi-service agreements, how to promote investment and technological advances, achieving a level playing field, and data and its important role in the changing sector. So we'll just give it a few minutes for the results to tabulate. In the meantime, I want to encourage you to please come up to the microphone and ask questions from the audience. So those who are brave enough to do so, I will bump you to the top of the queue. So please don't be shy. So let's see. Looks like data continues to be at the top here. So I'm going to start with you, Derek. You made some comments at the outset with respect to data and how this used to be, SCADA was kind of like the priority, and now services and opportunities are quite different. So if you want to,
So I think not all innovation, but obviously a big chunk of software innovation. The fuel for that is going to be data, right? And I think that on some of our prior calls, we talked about the notion of there being too much data, which I think is clearly not the case. I think that for someone to make an opinion that there's too much data, that would lead you to the conclusion you actually know what to do with the data. And I think that today we are only starting to understand the power of data science and what it can have its input on the electricity sector. So I think that if you compare the IESO and you compare like the NISO and other regions, the availability for data and the granularity actually is not as good. So the performance of peak software in other markets like New York, we're able to use deep learning techniques and actually forecast the actual shape of the entire state of New York within 99.7% accuracy within a 12-hour window. And we are good at what we do, but it's really the data that we get access to, and we understand how to take the data that's available on the NISO websites and that's available, and also overlay that with third-party information in our own. In Ontario, we struggle, even though our performance is very good, just because there is a lack of data on the distribution line in terms of that, and the zonal load data is not available. So that requires us to come up with more innovative solutions to go do that. So I think that, to really foster innovation, the availability for data is going to be super, super key. And understanding, I know there's been a lot of talk with OEB about data and what's going to happen in ISO about data availability and APIs and so on and so forth. But I think you don't need to be too sniperish around it. I think the reality is we don't really know what data is available today because we're still trying to figure out what the problems are that we're trying to face. So to me, it's about getting as much data as we can, being a little bit smarter around the time stamping of the data and the quality of the data, just because if you've got data that's hourly and you're trying to overlay that with 10-minute data from another source, it's almost useless, the 10-minute data. So the more data, the better. And I think that once you have that data and you're able to articulate what the problems are, you'll be surprised what these innovative minds in software are able to solve. But it'll all start with the data that I don't think has been as important. There's been no reason besides perhaps reporting and some other things for that. But I think it's going to be, pivotal to the future of where we're going to go in the electricity market.
I agree, Derek, and I think that data will bridge the relationship of behind the meter and in front of the meter. And I think that's what really has got to happen here. For instance, we're building commercial and industrial battery installations. We're using them for very limited periods of time with our customers. What about all the other time and all the other opportunities that the system could use those facilities? And I think data and that information is going to be absolutely critical to the future of the system. I think data is probably the most important thing to push the electricity market forward, and we need to do a lot more in our systems. And I too find that in some areas we don't have the data easily accessible to us. Some areas we do, and it does slow things down. And so I think, again, matching demand and supply efficiently and using all the assets of our system more efficiently is what we need to achieve, any business needs to achieve in terms of going forward. And I know that the system that we have obligations in terms of the resiliency and the safety and all of that, but I think there are answers. There are people doing different things. We've got great ideas to steal from around the world. And I think that if we can really bridge the gap and really get regulators, industry people, and government working together to build that vision, that future, develop that strategy, and regulate it correctly, I think there is no stopping us.
If I could just comment on data, I was just speaking very practically. We as a demand response aggregator, we aggregate hundreds, if not thousands, of meter points and data points across the province. And what we found is that actually a significant barrier where getting access to timely data is still stuck at the LDC level. And it's not blaming the LDCs, it's just the way that our system's been put together. When the EMI framework was created over a dozen years ago, there was discussion around having third-party access to meter data. And we're more than a decade past the rollout of the AMI, and we're nowhere closer to that. And until we actually enable fast, even real-time access to that data, we won't be able to engage the demand side to the extent that we should. So there are many initiatives that have been discussed, whether it's the Green Button Initiative, even expansion of the smart meter entity to allow the smart meter entity to provide third parties with access to data. I think those are very simple things to do, and I think we should focus on enabling access to data because that will enable the demand side.
I think that these are all very fair comments. I think back to when we opened the wholesale electricity market in 2002. We moved from an Ontario Hydro command and control structure to something that was based on a 5-minute financially binding price. And the way that we were able to make that transition was because we provided a lot of information and a lot of data in support of it. And so we had, daily security and adequacy assessments, 18-month outlooks, and a whole variety of products. And so it's that information and it's that that data that supports a distributed decision-making model that allows different people to go ahead and read that information and then respond accordingly. As we prepare for market renewal, and people know the market renewal initiatives of the energy stream and the capacity stream, we have parallel efforts in our planning area to go ahead and introduce the things like the annual planning outlook. So the annual planning outlook came out last September, and it's as the name implies, it's annual. We provided a certain amount of information last year. We expect to enhance that this year, but it wasn't a pure coincidence that that report was released last year and will continue to be released. It's all in aid of that distributed decision making and providing the right information for people to move forward. And so in that light, I agree with your comments.
So I'd be interested to hear from you how this access to data might also translate into leveling the playing field, I think, which was another topic that the audience is interested in hearing about. So I'm going to start with you, Paul. In your opinion, what are some ways the electricity market can become more balanced in terms of resource participation? And what role do you envision for traditionally smaller players and/or distribution-connected assets?
So again, back to what we do on a day-to-day basis is we look for those smaller resources that are behind the meter that are cost-effective, and we can aggregate those in order to deliver those as a demand-side resource for the ISO. And so we often encounter, we're moving away from a centralized to a decentralized system. And I think the ISO has been doing yeoman's work in moving us there, but it is a big paradigm shift. And when you do a paradigm shift, there is always an unbalance in terms of that playing field. And I think we have a great opportunity. And again, the whole market renewal, the moving into a capacity market, the incremental capacity market, we are identifying all those issues on a level playing field. But speaking very specifically, there are things like enabling generation resources and demand-side resources to be able to participate in similar offerings. So as a very practical example, generators can participate now in the demand response into the ICI, now the transitional capacity auction, where we're bidding into, but they can also bid into other ancillary services like operating reserve and others, where the demand side still isn't able to participate in those. So we're working with the ISO. I mean, they think they've heard our concerns, but those are examples of leveling the playing field, ensuring that no matter what the technology is, what the resource is, as long as it provides what the ISO needs, then they should be able to participate in multiple offerings. And that, in fact, will reduce the overall cost of that resource if it can participate in multiple offerings. So whether it's ICI, whether it's demand response, operating reserve, regulation services, et cetera, if you can allow for that, then I think that's really where you'll get to a level playing field.
I echo your remarks. Look, to make it a level playing field, we are competing with incumbents that have retired assets or assets that are much less costly than ours. And how do you get new entrants? How do you get investors to invest in this new environment? And I hope and I pray that we move towards multiple revenue streams and pay per performance. Because energy storage, and I'll talk specifically about this. And this is flywheel technology, this is compressed air technology, this is battery technology, this is pumped hydro. The battery particularly has the capacity to be a load and generator, and so it can, it can be an operating reserve and also provide frequency regulation. It can do more than one service to the ISO or to whatever client we have. And I think finding ways to, that would really help level the playing field for, I think, new entrants if we found the ability to, and I think Matt talked about it, find those multiple stacked revenues that could really, really make a difference. And the pay performance issue is, I think, extraordinarily important. And, with some of these assets, you can do a lot more with these electrons. You don't have to send them down south. You can store it and wait till the market needs it. And so there are all kinds of things that I think that we need, and the complexity, and there are going to be a lot more DERs. There really are. And no one's going to stop that. It's going to happen. It's going to happen. And so to get ready for that, I think, finding ways to deal with and provide revenue streams for those services that are so important and more cost effective and less expensive for the ratepayer.
Yeah, so I think it's the same thing that everyone's saying over here. To level the playing field, we just want to make sure that services provided by DERs are paid for based on the value they provide to the grid. So based on their location, based on their ability to ramp up and ramp down. I think that's pretty straightforward stuff. I think unlike other types of generations that have huge growth in Ontario, there's no subsidies with this stuff. We're just asking for pay us for the service that we actually are providing. I also think it goes into the interconnection piece, right? I think we haven't really touched too much on that piece, but currently the way that the interconnection process works, there isn't one standard process across the board in terms of how you can interconnect a behind-the-meter battery with an LDC, and in fact, they actually treat it like parallel generation, the exact opposite of how I plan to operate my entire fleet, right? So I'm never going to charge during the day and actually create a peak. That's how we make our money, right? So even the ability to put a widget that stops me from doing that, I'm okay with, but I just think there's some key fundamental things that we can do that don't take much to just enable a fair playing field to allow us to compete with other types of generation. And I think that that's all that's really needed, and streamlining the interconnection piece. And I think what you'll start to see is more companies come in with more money from external parts, and you'll start to move capital. The policy risk is something that will not necessarily even the playing field. That will be something that we want. But even the playing field is just giving us true market signals that value what we're actually going to do, and just make sure that when you allow us to interconnect, that it's based on the actual operations that we're going to do, not because we are lumped into something that's already been done before, right? And it's just easier to do it that way. And I think
just to put it in perspective, for one of our first projects, we had to pay $600,000 for interconnection fees on a $5 million project. How do you do that? You can't. Again, is there a way that we can design and accelerate innovation on these smaller projects, what we call pilots, faster? Better still, let's move directly into the large commercial ones.
I'll say one last point, though. You asked about, no one really answered your question about the role of small companies. So having spent most of my career in Ontario, I would say there's never been a better time for small companies to have an impact in the energy sector. Usually it was always about a diseconomies of scale of large IPPs coming in and doing really, really big things, and really their job was to aggregate a bunch of land leases, and they got bought up by a really big player. Where it stands today, when you're aggregating much smaller assets and it has to deal with software, the role of small players are going to be the ones to be able to test the new business models. They'll be able to do things that bigger companies can't do, and then they'll have to, and they should partner with bigger companies to make sure they can reach scale. But I think that there's a very unique time for small companies like us over here to actually create a positive impact, but then it has to be in collaboration with some of the larger players as well, which I think we're doing. But I think it's an exciting time to be a small company, which isn't always the case in energy, right? A lot of times the bigger player always wins.
Great feedback. Leonard was taking lots of notes, so I think that's a good sign.
Hopefully I can pull it out in a coherent fashion. So Paul talked about centralized and the movement to decentralized, and I think that that's a fair point. I think we start from a very strong foundation in Ontario. So last year, in 2018, about 85% of our energy and about 60% of our capacity came from hydroelectric and nuclear. So we have a really, really strong foundation of how those are provided. And so we really don't worry about that a lot. And so we worry about, where we're getting the rest of the stuff from. So we've got a good climate in Ontario to support innovative thought, given that foundation and that bedrock. We need a lot of different things in Ontario. We need energy, we need capacity, we need a wide variety of ancillary services, and I expect the need for ancillary services, these reliability services, to allow us to operate the grid reliably is going to increase over time as the nature of consumption and the characteristics of supply change. And so it's our job to go ahead and make sure that we are clear about what reliability services we require. My three colleagues here on the panel each deal with different technologies, and each of those technologies have different abilities to help us meet those reliability needs. And so there's no one-size-fits-all. And so I think it's important as a system operator to be clear about what reliability services we require and give the opportunity for people to compete and have limited barriers to go ahead and help us provide those services. As a system operator, and as I, with my opening comment was, we both operate a reliable system, and we try to do it efficiently through a market, and we try and find that balance. And so, adding new technologies to provide competition and new ways of solving these problems adds great value to us. But on the other side of it, we have to ensure reliability. And so, while new technologies are great, we want to make sure that we have assurance that they're going to deliver the services that we expect, so that I can give assurance to my boss and my bosses that we're able to operate the power system reliably.
I'm just going to do a check-in with the audience. Sorry, I have to stand up because I can't see that microphone. We've got about 10 minutes left, so any questions from the floor? Go ahead.
Thanks. It's Paul Lucan with CES. Just kind of sticking with the idea of data and maybe taking it specifically to visibility on the distribution system. I'm wondering what are the practical steps that should be taken now to essentially future-proof participation on the distribution side in either the ISO markets or some distribution type of market? And kind of further to that, what's the importance of enabling the ISO dispatch engine today, and in the next round of upgrades and IT upgrades, to be in a position that whether it's an ISO market of DERs or a distribution market of DERs, that we can get the full value of existing assets, and I just to underline the number of ICI storage projects that have gone in, versus conventional generators, dispatchable, that are off contract. And maybe just to throw one more idea out there, what's the impact of those two types of assets over the next 5-10 years in terms of GHGs?
Derek, do you want to take a stab at that?
I think I can do the first part. The other part is about IT, about the ISO. I don't think I can answer that. I guess the importance of having like a market at the distributed level, was that kind of the gauge of the question? Hopefully, but I'll say it is.
Just the importance of the data, so the visibility of the ISO to be able to see real-time operations of behind-the-meter assets or anything on the distribution side.
Oh, to see them. Okay, I'm not too sure I have
The rules today don't allow that, do
Yeah.
they? I mean, what you see what's in front of the meter, right, and not what's behind the meter. And maybe we should be looking at those rules.
Well, I think that there is visibility when a resource participates in an ISO, whether it's a market or a program, however you want to refer to it. So the example is the demand response market. So every single facility is registered with the ISO. So when the ISO dispatches that resource, even though it's behind the meter, they do have visibility to know what it is doing or should be doing. So there is that level of visibility. One of the areas, and you sort of touched on sort of operating the grid, one of the feedback we get from LDCs on a regular basis is that they're very frustrated by these behind-the-meter resources because they don't have see-through to them. And I think that's something we also need to address, that we have to allow the LDCs to somehow have some see-through, because that also impacts how they operate their distribution system. And some markets in North America, they do enable LDCs to procure non-wire solutions to help meet their distribution system needs. And so I think we have to, I think it was discussed at an earlier panel, is how do you bring the two together? Because you have the ISO developing behind the meter assets, distributed energy assets. How do the LDCs play into that? And I think that's a very important thing we do have to address. And that will certainly help. And you talked about the ISO dispatch tools, I think. One of the things that we're asking the ISO to look at and ensure that they act upon this as quickly as possible, and that is to develop the necessary tools where those distributed energy resources can participate in multiple offerings, rather than having one resource, one offering. And I think that's really, also to a certain extent, it's both regulatory but also a tool set question that has to be addressed. And so our ask from our industry is that becomes a priority for the ISO.
Leonard, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, sure. So I'll respond to a couple of things. So the notion and the challenges of looking at things or involving things in the distribution system are significant. From a principle standpoint, you've touched on it with regard to visibility. We need to see what's going on. Measurement and verification are also important, and certainly to ensure that ratepayers are getting the value out of the service that they're procuring. One of the interesting challenges that we're going to have to face in the distribution system is to make sure that as things on the distribution system are dispatched to provide a system benefit, that we're not working at cross purposes, because there are certain local requirements that are going to have to be met that the distributors going to want to protect their equipment. So we want to make sure that if a distributed energy resource is changing its output to satisfy a system need, that we're not causing local problems and vice versa. So there's some challenges to work out. I think one of the things that we can anticipate as we move forward is potentially a paradigm shift in how we go about looking at things on the distribution system. So the notion of a system operation is based on having basically complete data. So we know what the generators are doing, what the loads are doing, what the flows are in the transmission line. We take all of that together and put it into one big dispatch scheduling and optimization routine to go ahead and determine the optimum dispatch. And in the future, we're not going to have access to all of that data, because there's going to be rooftop solar and Tesla batteries that people aren't going to be aware of. And so I think it's going to require us to go ahead and shed in the appropriate spots this notion that we have to have complete data, and instead have enough data so we can go ahead and provide that visibility and control and make sure that we are operating those systems reliably.
Great. So I think we have time for one last question. If there's any from the floor. No? Okay. So I'm going to switch to multi-service agreements. So there's been talk at the panel today about revenue bundling, revenue stacking. So I'm going to pose this question to Annette. What value do multi-service agreements bring to the system operator? And conversely, what risks are associated with such concepts and should be recognized and clearly understood early on?
I think that, and Leonard and I have had this discussion a number of times, the benefits to certainly, our industry would be, I think, quicker, faster entrance into on the demand side in terms of energy storage. I think that, again, my reference to having assets that are not utilized and not efficiently operating doesn't make a lot of sense to me, never has. And if we're building a facility We should maximize the performance of it. And because energy storage is a load and is a generator and can provide 6 or 7 or 8 or 9 different services, having multiple revenue streams, even 1 or 2 to begin with, I think could really modernize the grid more quickly. I think it could get investors way more comfortable in investing in these technologies. And, you know, there's no question that, you know, on the operator side, we have to mitigate the risk on that side. But I'm sure we have got one of the best operators in the world, the ISO. And I'm sure that you guys can figure that out in terms of multiple contracts. What do you think, Leonard?
In 30 seconds or less.
I think that many technologies can provide multiple services. The question is, who should decide what services those resources should provide? From our perspective, we favor a model that says, here are the reliability services that we need. We can't anticipate all the different ways that people can use those technologies, and so we would prefer that the people who own the assets and do know those technologies can go ahead and target their operations to meet what the system needs.
But that's always going to be one-on-one, right? One service to one facility.
No, hopefully not.
Multi-second, yeah.
Yeah, so we get great value of resources that provide all kinds of energy, capacity, ancillary services, and the flexibility that goes along with it.
One thing, I mean, the biggest driver for me in my mind is cost. If you allow us to stack more revenue streams, it'll be better for the actual payers of electricity. With regard to the reliability issue, it's kind of like demand response. When you prescribe to things, you need to know that it's going to be available. I think there's a lot of innovative thought that could be handling there, whether it's a carrot or stick approach. So you could create like a credit rating like you have with your Uber driver, people that are participating on the DER side, and allow them to perhaps get higher revenue streams if they actually have been performing for a number of years, or they are able to have lower revenue streams if they haven't been performing, or they get barred for a period of time. So I think there's some very simple things you can look at other industries that have been utilized to make sure that there is some sort of credibility and confidence that when you subscribe to these services, they're going to be there, or what you're going to have is just a justification to oversubscribe. And then you've got another inefficient system where you basically are oversubscribing 1.5 times over because you don't believe people are going to be there. But I do think the carrot or stick approach plays a big role, and I think that stacking revenue streams is the future of where we need to go, and that'll ensure that the electricity bills don't go through the roof, right?
It's how Uber and Airbnb have
That's
broken
their
into the
model.
market. That's the model. And that's what's going to happen here eventually.
Great. Thanks very much, panelists. I hate to cut this short, but we're already a bit over time. So please join me in thanking the panelists.